few hours. Before we get started, we want to share with you a little bit of our heart behind this training and 3 reasons why disability is relevant to mission. Probably much like many of you, I felt called to be a missionary from a very young age, and I spent most of my childhood and teenage years pursuing that goal. But at the age of 21, I had a rare autoimmune reaction to a medication that left me legally blind. I was devastated, I was in pain, but most of all, I was angry. I was angry that God would give me this calling and passion and then take away what I felt was my ability to fulfill it. But a few years later, I met a man who was both a missionary and someone who was passionate about disability. And he told me that people with disabilities, if they were counted as a people group, would be the largest unreached people group in the world. In fact, the Lausanne Convention estimates that only 5 to 10% of the 1 billion people with disabilities in the world will ever hear the gospel in a meaningful way. If you're anything like me, this statistic is shocking. I'd spent so much of my time researching and reading about different people groups, but I'd never heard disability mentioned in the context of mission. In fact, this lack of awareness around disability and mission, I think, is one of the great perpetuators that keeps people with disabilities from being reached with the gospel. Before I myself was affected by disability in a very personal way, I thought it took a specialist to talk to someone with a disability. I'd never thought about how to share the gospel with someone who was nonverbal or what discipleship tools were available for people with developmental disabilities. And worst of all, I thought that reaching people with disabilities with the gospel was not my responsibility. The number 1 reason why disability is relevant to mission is that there are 900 million people in the world with disabilities who are unreached by the gospel. The second reason why disability is relevant to mission is that Jesus told us that it is. In one of my favorite passages in Luke 14, Jesus tells his disciples, "When you throw a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed." Through this mandate and the subsequent parable, Jesus tells us, his followers, that we are to invite people with disabilities into the banquet or the kingdom of God. I'm sure throughout this training you'll hear many other stories and examples of how Jesus reiterated and modeled this mandate to his followers. And finally, disability is relevant to mission because of its sheer prevalence. It's estimated that 15% of the population, or 1 billion people, are currently living with a disability. And that number is only increasing because of aging populations, increasing conflicts and humanitarian crises, and better treatments for conditions that used to be fatal. No matter what country or language or culture you're in, there will be people with disabilities there. And our hope is that by taking part in this training, you'll feel better equipped and more confident to engage with them when you encounter them. Throughout this training, you'll hear from a variety of people. You're going to hear from disability experts, from missionaries and ministry leaders, and most importantly, perhaps, from people with disabilities themselves. After hearing a theological basis for disability inclusion and getting an overview on disability, we're going to dive into how to engage, evangelize, and disciple people with a variety of disabilities. Just as the apostles told Paul to remember the poor when they sent him out to the nations, our plea through this training is that you would remember people with disabilities as you go out on mission.